It's true. I lived in Bucharest for 15 years, and I never got to go to Cluj because when I lived in Bucharest, there were no planes or highways. There's still no highways. So it'd take like 8 hours to go to Cluj, and my mother would be like, there's no way we're spending 8 hours in a car together. So here I am now. We're going to talk about fonts. I'm Monica. I'm not Waldorf on Twitter and GitHub and internet places where you might want to check it out. And I'm really excited about fonts. Oh, I work on a Polymer team most of the time, so I talk about web components and Polymer, which is a library that helps you write web components. But I won't be talking about that today. So if you want to chat about that, find me anywhere in a break. I'd love to nerd out about web components with you. I love them so much. But I really like fonts. I've always liked fonts. I wanted to be a font designer at some point for like a hot minute. Thankfully, I didn't do that. And I know everybody likes fonts because your slides are pretty and have custom fonts. JSHeroes, this is a custom font. And last year, I think somebody did a survey in HTTP Archive, and 68% of websites use web fonts. That's like more than half of every website out there. I think Google Web Fonts did, like, had their like 7-year anniversary or something, and they figured out that the Google Web Fonts have been used in over 17 trillion web views. That's like 2,000 views per person in the universe for the last 7 years. That's like at least one web font a day. Web fonts are everywhere. Web fonts are beautiful. This is why we like them. This is Helen Holmes's webpage about called Type is Your Right. She gave a really good talk about the history of typography and how it applies to web typography. Strongly recommend checking it out if you care about it. But it looks beautiful. It looks like a print magazine, but it's not. It's just a website. This is a site called hellohappy.org that takes Google Web Fonts and pairs them together to see how they might match and which goes with what. And they make it look beautiful. They make it, again, look like print magazines, which have a good, nice, artsy feel about them. And this is The New Yorker. It's my favorite magazine in the world. It's a New York magazine about culture and politics and, you know, just common life. But it's strongly associated with this font. This font was designed by Bea Irvin in 1920, and since then, The New Yorker has always used this font for every headline, for every title they've ever had. When The New Yorker came to the web, if they didn't have this web font, nobody would believe them that this was in fact The New Yorker. That's how associated with this font this is. So web fonts are very important for brands. It's how we say, this is our brand, this is The New Yorker. Web fonts are also terrible. I didn't want to shame anybody's website, so I put all of the fonts that I can think of on Hacker News, and it looks even worse than it normally does. And in particular, not only does it look hideous, but it's actually incredibly slow, because web fonts are kind of expensive to load. And this is what this talk is about. There's 3 things that you care about with web fonts. The first one, and if you use something like Google Web Fonts or a web font provider, you might see this a lot. You import a style sheet that takes you to a place. That place isn't the font file itself. That place is a font face definition. And a font face definition is basically a way we tell the browser, hey, I'm going to have this font ready for you. This font is going to be a font family of Roboto. So if you ever see Roboto, this is what I care. And in particular here, I'm saying that you have a weight of 400 and a style of normal. If you have like italic or bold, you would have another font face definition. So these are like the descriptions of a font that you can use in your site. And then the source that it comes from, and you can like use different sources, such like try to use the local one if it exists, maybe it has a different name, and so on. And then the last part about using a web font is the actually using bit. So it's like this thing wherever you're like, I actually want to use Roboto. So here you say font family Roboto to mean I want to use the font family Roboto here, whereas the previous font family Roboto said, these are the things that the font family Roboto can do. So this is why they're sort of similar and they always go together. My favorite description of the problem with web fonts comes with Zach Leatherman. He calls it the Mitt Romney web font problem. And it goes like this. 2 years ago, America had an election. Everybody knows, it went great. But at that point, when things were still looking promising and undecided, Mitt Romney, who was one of the candidates, may or may not, was announcing his candidacy to the presidency. He was not sure he was going to run or not. So Slate ran this article that James Muspratt took a picture of, and basically when he loaded it, it said, Mitt Romney is running for president. And then he waited 3 seconds, and it turns out he was not running for president. And that's because the not was a different font. It was an italic font face, and it was getting loaded separately, and you were on a slow connection, so it took extra long to get there. This is the Mitt Romney web font loading problem. And what you see here is called a FOIT, or a flash of invisible text. And this is when you see nothing for a while, and then you see text inside of it. So first we paint something invisible, and then we switch to a web font, flash of invisible text. The other problem that we have with web fonts is a flash of unstyled text. And this happens whenever we see something in a fallback font, like a really ugly sans serif, and then we wait a little bit, and then we switch to the web font that you actually want to use. If you get to pick one of them, always pick to have longer faut than foit. Foit is really bad because you see nothing. Your goal as a content provider is to actually get content to your user. Content is king, is a thing that typography people will say. And the reason why we have these problems is because browsers in general, as somebody who works on browsers, have a ton of opinions about everything, but in particularly web fonts, because they tend to affect everything. So I'm going to tell you, let me fix this, okay? So this is how web fonts get loaded in a browser, and this is why it's sort of a little bit complicated. You're going to go to a page, your index.html, you're going to get it from the cloud, you're going to be like, hey, cloud, give me this file. It comes back to the browser, and then the browser starts crunching on it, and starts crunching on it, and starts crunching, and it goes, aha, I've seen something of interest on this page, and that could be that link style sheet that I've showed you before. This is what normally happens on like smaller websites. And at this point, the browser's going to go, oh, sweet, I'm going to go download this file. But this is the first interesting thing about style sheets that you might not know, is that they're called render blocking. So when the browser starts downloading a style sheet, it stops painting to the screen. This is why if you have an enormous style sheet that you're trying to download, it's really bad for performance because you can't paint anything while we're downloading the style sheet. And this is because if you've seen a website recently that has like its styles completely borked, like none of the styles are applied, it looks terrible and it's not even clear what that website is trying to convey. So we're blocking painting while we're downloading the style sheet. And then it comes back, and it comes back with that font face definition that I've said before. And it can have, all of the details as before. And the browser is going to move on and start crunching and start crunching and start crunching, and it's going to go, aha, I've seen something else of interest on this page. I want to use, Roboto for this div. And here is the dirty secret of web fonts. Up until this point, you haven't actually downloaded the font. In the font face definition, all you've said is like, listen, at some point in the future, I might have this font that I need, and it's like its source is going to be at font.waf2 over there, but I haven't actually downloaded this file. And that's because browsers will never do any work that you don't ask them to do. They don't just do work for funsies. So maybe you never use this font. Maybe you're like super keen and put 700 font face definitions in the head of your website, but never actually use them. The browser is not going to download those. And this is where you get that flash of invisible text, because we didn't actually have the font ready when we started using it. Which leads us to the next question about web fonts, which is, well, how does the browser decide what to paint to the screen if it has the font or not? And this is the font lifecycle. So when the browser finally sees that line that says div font family Roboto, it goes, well, do I have Roboto? And in this case, it didn't. So, if it has it, for example, if you've already loaded it because somebody else used Roboto on that page, or maybe, you have it in the disk cache because you've been to this website before, so it loaded it and saved it in the cache. If it has it, it goes, great, awesome, paint everything in Roboto, moving on. But if it doesn't, it goes in what is called the block period. And in the block period is when we paint everything as invisible. So this is why we get that flash of invisible text. We have to stop for a little bit while we're trying to download this font, and then paint everything as invisible. And the length of this period changes based on browsers. It used to be infinity on the previous version of Safari. It used to be 0 in IE11. It's 3 seconds in Chrome, and now modern Safari, and I think Firefox. So we do nothing, basically. We paint invisible things to the screen for 3 seconds, and then we go, all right, cool. Do I have Roboto now? The 3 seconds is kind of enough time to download a font file. And then if you do, awesome, render in Roboto. But if we don't, we go in what's called the swap period. So at this point, over 3 seconds have passed. You haven't printed anything to the screen, and the browser goes, this is enough. We need to show something to the user. The user is going to leave this page otherwise. So we swap. We use the fallback font. In this case, sans serif is the first fallback font, which is like the system sans serif on your computer. It could be Helvetica on a Mac, or whatever other Arial on Windows or whatever. So then we're going to paint something in the fallback font, because some content is always better than no content at all. And then after a while, this could again be 3 seconds or like some length of time. If we find the font, we're going to render in it. And if we don't, the browser is going to go in this fail phase. And basically, What if I didn't actually write Roboto? What if I wrote Moboto? That's not a font that exists. We end up in this fail phase where the browser's like, I have no idea what this font you're asking me to paint is. You didn't give me the right file. I don't seem to be able to have it. Let's just move on. So these are the 3 stages that a web font can be in at any time. And what this looks like in real life is like this. So this is going to be a video of all of these like stages loading on, and it's not a fake video. The reason why I wrote this talk is because I went to Taiwan where I had like 2G internet for a week, and what you're about to see is what I basically saw for every single website that I try to visit. And it's this. We see nothing for a while. 3 seconds, yay, sans serif. Oh my God, pretty sans serif. I think that's actually a serif. So that's the first bit was the flash of unstyled text, and the next one, the invisible text, and the next one was the flash of unstyled text. My favorite part of this demo is the thing at the beginning where you see this like phantom underlines and bullets. And that's because the browser paints the text invisible, not the decorations of the text invisible. So if you have underlines because they're links, they're getting painted. If you have bullets, they're getting painted. That code is using like Courier Neo or whatever the monospace font is definitely getting painted because we have that font. So what you see is like this horrifying ghost mansion of what could be fonts, but in fact is not, which is great. So again, in that video, the first part was the flash of invisible text, which is from the block period, and the next one is the unstyled text. And at this point, you're going to take a step back, because I know I did it. I was like, listen, I know how to solve this entire problem. Make me president of browser engineers. You should just have no block period at all, right? Just make that one 0, always print something to the screen. Everything is going to be amazing. And now, a story. The reason why we have a block period in the first place is because there's a lot of cases in which showing a fallback font doesn't make sense. The reason why we have web fonts to begin with is that back in the day, David Hyatt used to work for WebKit. And he was like one of the WebKit engineers. And apart from working on WebKit, he also worked on something called iBooks, which is now an application to just, see, read books. But at the time, it was in a browser. And that's why he needed web fonts, because books tend to be typeset in a particular font that the editor and the author agree on. And he was like, well, I want something better than, like, I don't know, Courier Neo or whatever the modern font at the time was. So he was like, sweet, I'm going to download a web font in the browser. And for him, the block period made the most sense, because when you get a physical book, you don't like first open it, it's in Comic Sans, blink a couple of times, and then you see it typeset in something pretty. You open it, and it's always the correct font. So for him, for iBooks, it made no sense to have this fallback period. So he was like, listen, block and paint nothing until you have something good to paint, and then the person will just read that book like a normal person. And the block period was infinity for a very long time, until Chrome engineers were like, okay, infinity turns out to be really bad if you have a slow connection, because you just never see anything. So they decreased it to 3 seconds, and here we are. So great, now we know why fonts are really shitty, but what can we do about this? Well, we can control these periods. We can control this like blocking and swapping period. And the most important thing that you should get out of this is that invisible text is way, 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 way worse than ugly text. Ugly text means you can read something. It's not the prettiest thing, but you can at least get the news. Invisible text means that you're looking at a blank page with weird underlines on it and go, great. So let's minimize this flash of invisible text. This is our goal. We're web developers. We can do this. The easiest answer is, what's faster than a web font? No web font at all. If you don't need a web font, don't use a web font. If you're just using a web font for like a slightly prettier sans serif for your like body copy, and your site is like a news agency, you probably don't need that web font for the body copy, so just don't use it. Use something in the browser's operating system stack. This is something that I copy from GitHub every single time. This is their font family that they use on github.com. And it basically uses, your system font and then your Mac system font. There's another like -- system font, I think, attribute as well. And then they start falling back to like, well, maybe Helvetica, maybe Arial, maybe like the emoji font in case this is like an actual emoji, and so on. That's a really good stack. If you just want like a regular website, this is what I use for basically anything that I build for the body content, and it works great. But if you really, really, really need a web font, just try to download the smallest web font that you can. Carolina, and I don't want to butcher her name, Suskur? She's @Fox on Twitter. I definitely butchered her name. It has all consonants. She has a great blog post and talk from last year called The State of the Web. And in it, she goes through every single thing that you can optimize on a website. And in particular, she goes into great detail about what all of the different font file versions and versions mean. In particular, her conclusion is WAF2 is the smallest, it's the most compressed file, so it's the least bytes you have to download. It doesn't work in IE11, but in IE11 you can fall back to like a different format. So on most of your modern browsers, you should download a WAF2 file. The most compression means that it's going to be the fastest download. But that isn't quite enough, because you can download even fewer things than just bytes. Most fonts that are designed to cover like a multitude of languages. For example, Romanian has like S's with commas and A's with hats, which English doesn't have. If you know you're writing a website that only requires English characters, just download only the characters that you need for that. And we can do this with a couple of tools and Unicode range. So Unicode range tells the browser, this font family is only available for like the letters between A and Z, or whatever that range is. For anything else, use the fallback font, because this font is not going to give it to you. Actually, if you saw, I don't want to pick on him, but Dominic's last slide had mulțumesc in an italic font, but the ți didn't belong to that font, so it was like a non-italic letter, because the browser was like, well, I don't have that letter in this font, so I'm just going to use the next one, which was just a regular font, which is exactly what this does. This is exactly what this means. Now, in order for that font file to also be smaller, you have to use a tool that it strips away all of the Unicode characters that you don't want. I think Zach Leatherman has a tool and a blog post about this. Generally, if you have any questions about what should I do with this weird web font situation, the answer is go see what Zach Leatherman has written about this. So good. So now we have the most compressed file, only the characters that we need. We can download all of these things earlier. So if you remember, when we were downloading, when I was showing you when the browser actually downloads the font, we didn't actually start downloading the font till way late in the page, where we actually used that font in a selector. So we need to somehow tell the browser to just download that font earlier, even if he doesn't believe us that it should download it. Right, this is the file. And then we can do this with link rel equals preload, which is a new spec in the browser that's basically a hint from us, the web developers, to the browser that you pinky swear you're really going to need this file. Now, the browser doesn't really believe you, so you have to it really has to trust you on this one. So you go, listen, browser, I know you don't think so, but I really need this file. Download it now. Of course, the trick here is that you can't just put preload on everything, because then the browser's not going to trust you, and it's going to be like your banana pants. You just want everything downloaded now. And the browser is really good at optimizing the things that you need to download. So only use this sparingly for the really crucial scripts or images or fonts that you want to download really early. Awesome. So now we've done all of the work. The file that we want is the smallest. It's as early as possible. But we're still going to get a flash of invisible text, because it's still not going to be instant with the page load. And this is where Font Face Observer comes in. Font Face Observer is an awesome little JavaScript library. It's 4K, I think. It's written by Bram Stein, and it basically lets you control that block and swap period. It's basically what you want from the universe. And if you remember anything from this talk, it's going to be this thing right here. So pay attention. Font Face Observer. It is great. So the way you normally use web fonts is you slap one of them on a body or something, and then we rely on the browser to know how to do the swapping. But instead, what we can do is put that in a special class, and then by default on the body, we render things in the fallback font. And the idea here is that when I'm confident and good and ready that I have actually downloaded Roboto, I can manually put that class on the body and then switch the font myself. Now, this is exactly what Font Face Observer does. You can create a font face observer for a particular font that you want, and then try to load it. And then when it gets loaded, the library will give you a promise. And then in this promise, you can set the class on that body element, or whatever element you want to render in a web font. But you can do also smart things. You can have a timer and be like, well, how long did it actually take for this font to download? Was it 15 seconds? If it was, I promise you that 15 seconds into reading this BuzzFeed article, I'm going to get really grumpy if you then just switch the web font and relay out everything for me and I miss my spot. So don't do that. So you can do very smart things with font face observers. And I'm really excited this library existed for a very long time, because it basically told browser engineers that they have to do that. They have to give this power of controlling the block and the swap period to actual developers. And because I work on browsers, this is the thing that I'm very excited about, because there's a new selector in CSS that basically lets you exactly do that. And that is font display optional. So font display is a new attribute, and you can put it in that font face definition, and it basically tells the browser, listen up, browser, I know you want to do your classic thing when loading fonts, but I know better, and you should listen to me. And it is amazing. Every time you get to do the browser, you get to tell the browser to do what you want them to do is excellent. So here's how it works. You have that font face definition, and you put it in the font face definition, and font display has different options. So you can have different loading options for different fonts that you have, because some fonts you might actually want to block, something like icon fonts, and I'll show you this diagram in a second. But again, it applies to a particular font face definition, so not your entire web font stack at once. And here's the 4 different options it can have. Font display block, which is the default one that I've basically been telling you for 20 minutes, is you do nothing, you block for at most 3 seconds while you're waiting for the font, and then you paint in the fallback font for a while, and then when you get it, you paint in the web font. This is great. This is also auto. The next one is font display swap, which is a little bit different in the sense that it paints 0 seconds of invisible text. It's that, hold on, I'm going to fix the web, idea that I had. That's font display swap. So it basically never paints invisible text. It instantly paints the fallback text, and then waits and waits and waits until it finally gets the web font, and then it paints in that. Font display fallback is a little bit even smarter than this. It gives you a very small block period. So it's something like 100 milliseconds. This isn't long enough for you to download the font. This is just long enough to get it from the web font cache. So if you've been to this page before, you've cached this font and it's ready for the next use. If it's not in the web font cache, you move on and you paint in the fallback font. And when you get the web font, you switch to that. So, and I think this actually waits for 3 seconds. And if the web font never comes, you still switch. So sorry. And then the next one is font display optional. And this is why it's perfect, because it's exactly the behavior you want for a body of text. So again, it waits the 100 milliseconds. If the font is ready, you can use it. And if not, so if it's ready, you use it. But if it's not, you paint in the fallback font and you never switch again. This is why it's really good if you have something where your application or your website is mostly content-based. If you just want to read the news or a blog post or something, the user doesn't really care what font you read it in. They just really want to read the text. So font display optional is perfect for that. If you have the pre-text, you get to use it. If you don't, just give the user a font and they'll be happy with it. Font display block is something that you need for something like icon fonts or brand fonts where there's no acceptable fallback for you to use. What this looks in real time is like this. So I made this little demo. And at the top, it's a very slow server. So I delay returning the font by 4 seconds. And at the bottom, it's a fast connection. And the idea here would be the fast connection is probably the Wi-Fi that you have in your house. And the slow connection is, when you're roaming and you have 2G and everything's slow. In that corner where you see nothing for a very long time, that's the default browser behavior. The font display optional is the one where you saw text instantly. It was ugly, but hey, it was text. And this is why controlling how you load fonts is really important. So this is awesome. We have now done everything we can to minimize the flash of invisible text. When we're lucky, we don't even have any invisible text. Font display optional works in Chrome and Safari and Firefox, I believe. So it's actually available in most of the browsers that you probably care about. So now that we've done this one out, let's talk about minimizing the unstyled text, because that's still a problem. And the only thing that you can do with minimizing the unstyled text is making sure that your fonts look the same, have less of a jarring transition between your fallback font, which is your ugly sans serif, and your web font that you want. And Tim Brown came up with a really good trick for this, where basically you line up the 2 fonts that you care about on top of each other, and you look how different they are. And they're obviously going to be different. The font sizes aren't going to be the same. The letter spacing between characters isn't going to be the same. But if you get to adjust them a little bit, so you get to adjust some of the X heights and the widths between them, the fonts can look closer and closer together. And they can at least look sort of the same size, so that when you flip from one to the other, you don't relay out the whole page and images start jumping around because all of the lines are longer and you get extra characters. This is kind of annoying to do on your own, so I built this tool called Font Style Matcher that basically lets you load 2 fonts from Google Fonts, a fallback font and your web font, and then actually play with all of these variables that you might want to use. So here at the bottom, you see how different the two fonts are initially, and then you can start adjusting the font size of your fallback font so that it looks more like what the future will be. And then by the end, they look sort of similar, that you don't even see the jank between them switching, which is kind of great because that means your website is going to look sort of okay, even if it's doing this flipping between the fonts. This is awesome. Now we have fixed our flash of invisible text. We fixed our flash of unstyled text. We basically have fixed all of web font loading. Let's talk about fun things with web fonts, because web fonts are still really awesome. And the first exciting thing that I found is icon fonts. And icon fonts are not new. I know everybody's using an icon font. They've been around for like 74 years. But I've recently seen a new way of doing icon fonts, which I thought was really interesting, and that's using ligatures. So ligatures are a really awesome font construct where letters look like something most of the time, but when 2 letters are next to each other, they look a little bit different. So F and I are a good ligature because an F and an I together have like a smushed top where like the dot of the I comes into the F and it looks kind of weird. But what the font does is basically has like this list of ligatures, so when it sees 2 of these characters together, it paints a completely different glyph. In this particular case, a way nicer F and I together. So what the material design icon font does is that if you see here at the bottom, you don't actually have like a class like how you normally use Font Awesome or something where you have like an image or like a class and then it swaps an image inside of it. You just have the word settings, and the font has settings as a ligature that transforms into, you know, the gear of that. So it basically just uses ligatures to do icons, which is kind of awesome, and I hadn't seen that before. Of course, the most awesome thing about fonts is that you should just make your own. Why not? It's kind of easy. It takes 2 steps to do your own font. The first one is to draw some things, like those things on the board. And then there's no other step 2, because there's a lot of sites and applications to actually just put that as a font together. Fontastic.me is a site that I really like that basically lets you specify what Unicode character you want a particular image to show up for. I'm obsessed with emoji, so obviously the only font I've ever drawn was an emoji font. And this is how I did it. I basically specified all of the Unicode characters for hearts and arrows and music and stuff like that. And then I drew by hand the original 1999 Docomo emoji font, and then I just put them together. And then you get this. At the top is what the emoji would look like if the font weren't applied, and at the bottom is if the font is applied. It's just the font, so you don't have to do anything. Your markup doesn't change. It's kind of awesome. The other kind of new thing about fonts is variable fonts. And they're basically sorcery. They're super new and barely supported anywhere, but they're incredibly exciting. The way you normally use fonts is that you have different font files. So you have like a condensed roboto and a wide roboto and a bold roboto and an italic roboto. And these are all different files that you have to download over and over again. And then you have to know which one you want to use. But with a variable font, you basically have one font file and like witchcraft in the background that basically interpolates between all of these values. So you can have like a weight of 125. That doesn't mean it gets rounded down to 100. It just means the weight is 125. It's like slightly fatter than 100, but not as fat as 200. And the way you use it is with font variation settings. So if a font is a variable font, it documents these like variation settings that it cares about. In this particular case, weight and width. And then you can give it some sort of like, you know, float number value for what you want the value to be. In practice, it looks like this. This is a demo from Access Practice. And it's a font called Amstervar, and you can make it as wide as you want. And these are, again, not like discrete increments that a font designer has drawn. You have one font file, and you just like pick different heights and widths. It's very exciting for fonts that have decorations. So this is a font where you can control like the hooves and the concavity, so you can add all of these decorations so that you can, you know, more customize your website like depending on what happens to it. And again, in here you have, I don't know why all the font variation settings are like named very cryptically, where you have to think for 7 minutes what CN might be. I think it's concavity. FR is fringes. But then there they are, and once you figure out what you want, you can just adjust those properties and combine them together. A really awesome demo I've seen is with icon fonts. This is not accessible, obviously, so you'd still have to do extra work for it. But you have a web font that's icons that has variation settings that you can make, the cat move and the moon come in and out, and the biker. You could just make a biker move throughout your entire screen with like one web font and a character. So I made this demo called Variable Lizards, where you just have the lizard moving on a screen. Why not? Just do that. That's a great screensaver. It's soothing. It's calming. It's moving down. So that's it for web fonts. These are my favorite resources. Bramstein recently wrote a web font handbook. It's available online. It's wonderful. Helen Holmes has a lot of material on this. And Zach Litherman has literally written every single blog post about web fonts that you will ever need in your life. So I recommend following him on Twitter and everything. And that's it. Use web fonts correctly. Thank you.